Behold, Augur Reach, a Warframe mod that increases ability range and grants you shields, or potentially overshields, equal to 40% of any energy you spend on ability activation costs. The Augur bonus doesn't give you shields, or importantly overshields, if your frame doesn't have shields to begin with, like on Inaros. And while there are minor uses for the Augur bonus, you'll probably be looking for Augur Reach for its range increase, so I'll touch on the Augur bonus in a few minutes. But mostly I'm here to talk about the range. And since Stretch gives you 45% range, and is only 2 more capacity and is much more readily available, Augur Reach is in a weird position where you usually wouldn't want to use it unless you already have other range mods equipped. So its main role is that it increases the max possible range. This is the case with a lot of its fellows in the Augur set. The usefulness of Augur Reach then depends on how often you would want to get that extreme range. And on the surface, I feel like it seems like there are lots of reasons to want high range. Warframe is a game full of farming, so having your abilities that kill enemies have really large range in Warframe's relatively large maps definitely seems like a valuable thing, and there are plenty of situations where getting max range is a lot of fun and really valuable. Still, I feel like range isn't a very threshold-focused stat, so what I mean by that is that it's not usually the case that you need a certain amount of range, and then once you hit that threshold, suddenly you get some new thing, it becomes enough. So an example of a stat that is very threshold-focused is strength. A lot of the time you have a frame that maybe has an ability that removes armor, and you're trying to do slash damage, which is inhibited by armor, or maybe some other, etc. So you care about specifically removing all of the armor, and at a certain amount of power strength, the ability will remove all armor, whereas before that threshold, it removed some armor, it still did something, but it didn't do some additional thing that it then does when you have enough of it. So there's a way in which a lot of strength can become enough versus not enough, whereas range, it's not usually like that. Usually it's just you have more range or less range. A quick counterexample is Zephyr's Turbulence. Zephyr's Turbulence will deflect projectiles from you, and if it gets way too low, sometimes you can get shot, but usually it's fine. The problem with Turbulence is that its radius is affected by range, and if you don't have enough range, sometimes explosives can get close enough to you that they don't hit you, but they explode on something near you that is close enough to you that you will get hit. So if you have a certain threshold of range, my testing it's like 145, 160% or so, then you won't get hit even by explosives exploding near you because they can't get close enough to you to explode that way. That's a really oblique example and a good example of how range is not a threshold focused stat because that almost never applies. You don't need a set amount of range. Range is much more of a preference, playstyle, or gravy stat. But that doesn't mean it's not good. A lot of things benefit from range very highly. It's just to say that you don't usually need a set amount of it more than before. And again, this isn't the case with some other stats where having the ability to get more of it with no drawback is a pretty big upgrade, something really nice. So stacking range, sometimes not so effective, but definitely valuable in general. There are also a lot of cases where range, it's kind of like you could play around it, like you could replicate its effect by playing differently. Again, very much not the case with something like strength. So for example, if you're playing Necros and you want to make as much loot as possible with Desecrate, you might find that if you have a lot of range, your allies still just aren't near you. Like if the enemies are not dying near you, then having a little more range doesn't mean the enemies are suddenly dying near you. If your allies aren't trying to kill enemies near you in a survival, it doesn't matter how much range you have, you're still not going to desecrate the bodies. So truth be told, you just need to get closer to your allies. It doesn't overly matter how much range you have. And I personally find that running range on Necros can be a little underwhelming. But this is just an example. And again, it can be the case that it's very effective, especially for those more campy strategies and you're doing a defense mission, let's say. It's just the case that sometimes range is not so valuable. So even though on the surface it might seem like, oh, range is awesome, more range is the best, I feel like range is a stat that can be a little flimsy. It's like you can always have less range, it feels like. And this is only not the case when you have abilities like, let's say, Garuda's Blood Siphon, her second ability. That ability, you kind of need to stay alive by staying near it. So if its radius is too small, it can be really annoying to use it to stay alive. And that's a case where, yeah, I mean, if you can't within reason keep playing while inside of its radius, you might need more range, and it's a survivability thing. And of course, range can affect buffing as well, which can be important. You can't be asked to be right on top of your allies, so you need to have enough range that they'll reasonably get buffed. But there's also kind of another weird problem with Augur Reach. So the Augur bonus on Augur Reach kind of implies that you have ability to reduce damage dealt to shields. And those abilities aren't that likely to want range. So like if let's say you have some defensive ability and you use it and now you have damage reduction that also affects shields. A lot of those abilities just don't really care about range. So Shatter Shield is a good example. An ability that's affected by range but doesn't overly care too much about it would be Splinter Storm, Gara's Splinter Storm. These abilities reduce damage dealt to shields, so they might be kind of interested in the Augur bonus, meager though it may be, but they don't care about range. So the Augur bonus being paired with range is not particularly good. Compare this to something like Augur Message, which gives you duration. It's pretty much the same mod, it just gives you duration instead of range. This is pretty good because abilities that reduce damage dealt to shields are likely to care about duration, whereas they might not be affected by range. In fact, tanks in general, tanky warframes in general, aren't quite so likely to want extreme range. They can presumably get close to enemies. They don't need to affect them from far away because they're tanky, so it's okay if they don't have a lot of range. And again, you're not usually using this mod unless you already have other range mods equipped. I found that although this mod is reasonable, it's like not a bad mod or anything, I've been using it way less than I expected I would when I first saw it come out, just because again, you're not using it until you already have a lot of range mods, and usually you just don't need that much more range. You don't need that much range. It's a convenience thing. And yet on a lot of my favorite loadouts, I find myself using it because I like having a lot of range. It's convenient. Still, I feel like the existence of Cunning Drift kind of puts the nail in the coffin for this mod. You can get half the amount of range that this mod gives with your Exilis slot. And again, you're already assuming that you have usually stretch equipped before you'd be considering this mod, which really limits how often it's used. That's Augur Reach. I've been Zandy, and you've been tuned to the ModCast.